Good evening. Tonight, we're heading east, far across vast plains and frozen mountains, into the heart of the 13th century, where survival was earned with grit and mercy was as rare as a quiet sky. We're diving into the world of the Mongol Empire. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you're curled up in bed, wrapped in a blanket, or simply seeking a quiet moment before sleep, I invite you to get cozy, settle in, and let your mind travel back to the windswept steppe. Tonight, you'll learn why you wouldn't last a day in the Mongol Empire. Let's begin. The Mongol steppe was not a place that welcomed strangers, nor did it tolerate weakness. It was a land that bred a certain kind of person, toughened by the wind, molded by the cold, and sharpened by scarcity. Stretching from the arid plains of Central Asia to the foothills of the Altai Mountains, the steppe was vast and pitiless. There were no cities to shield one from the elements, no stone walls to cradle a fragile body in safety. Just the rolling sea of grass, flattened by the hooves of 1,000 horses, and the endless sky above, bright and blue during the day, black and star-swept at night. There were no trees to break the wind, no rivers that ran gentle, and no valleys where one could hide from the sun or snow. The landscape seemed alive with indifference, and to live in it was to be in constant negotiation with death. The seasons were not balanced here. Winter came hard and lingered like a guest who would not leave, dropping temperatures so low that a man could freeze to death before he finished saddling his horse. Winds blew with the kind of violence that stripped flesh from bone, and storms arrived without warning, blanketing the world in snow so thick that entire herds vanished beneath it. In the summer, the land did not grow soft. Instead, the sun scorched the plains until they cracked open, and the only shade was what you could make with your own body. Sandstorms carried whole clouds of dust that burned the lungs and blinded the eyes. It was said that those who could endure the weather of the steppe were harder than the warriors they fought, and in the Mongol Empire, that was no small thing. The land was endless. It stretched out in every direction, a boundless sea of grass swaying beneath a vault of sky so vast and unbroken that men believed it touched the edge of heaven. This was the steppe. This was the cradle of the Mongol people, and the forge from which the fiercest empire the world had ever known would rise. It was a place of stark contrasts, where life clung to hardship with the same tenacity as the wind clung to the hides of the yurts. There were no stone cities here, no marble columns or winding streets. There were no great libraries nor towering cathedrals. Civilization, as it was known in the West or in the distant courts of China, was not born here. Instead, there were herds of sheep and goats, wild horses running across the plains, and men who lived on horseback as easily as they breathed. In this world of motion and survival, men carried their homes on carts, their stories in memory, and their gods in the sky. The Mongols, and the many other tribes who roamed the steppe before the empire took shape, believed the heavens watched them. They did not worship carved idols or kneel before gilded shrines. Their sacred was the eternal blue sky, called Tengri, a divine presence vast and silent, as omnipresent as the wind that bent the grasses. Tengri did not make demands in the manner of earthly kings. It did not promise salvation nor threaten punishment. It simply existed, endless and powerful, granting favor to the strong and punishing the weak with indifference. Beneath its gaze, clans lived and died, hunting, herding, warring, and migrating in ancient cycles. Their lives were shaped by the rhythm of the seasons. Spring brought the calving of animals and the renewal of pastures. Summer demanded long migrations. Autumn required preparation. Winter brought hardship, starvation, and snow deep enough to bury the bones of the dead. There were no borders here. Land belonged to no man, though it was fought over constantly. Power on the steppe did not come from ownership, but from strength. A man was known not by what he built, but by what he could take and defend. Wealth was measured in livestock and loyalty. A chief could command 10,000 men in the morning and die alone in the snow by nightfall. Alliances were forged in marriage and shattered in betrayal. Feuds ran deep, sometimes spanning generations. The sons of the wolf and the deer, as they saw themselves, were quick to ride and quicker to fight. And yet, for all the violence and hardship, there was a fierce beauty to it all. There was poetry in the gallop of a stallion across the plains. There was serenity in the quiet of night, when only the stars blinked above the black curve of a yurt's crown. This was not a land of peace, but it was a land of order, an order born of necessity and endurance. It was within this world that a child named Temujin would one day be born, though in these early years no such name stirred the winds. The tribes roamed, ever shifting like the tides, each with their own legends, their own customs, and their own scars. There were the Tatars, cunning and numerous, who favoured ambush and treachery. The Merkits were raiders and horse thieves, proud of their independence. The Naimans lived further west, wealthier and more cultured, with kings and written laws, yet bound to the same fierce traditions. And then there were the Mongols, a smaller people at the time, broken into scattered clans that quarrelled endlessly among themselves. Theirs was a name spoken without fear, without reverence, and often without regard. They were considered insignificant by their rivals, poor, divided, unworthy of alliance or respect. Among these tribes, survival was a matter of both strength and cunning. Children learned to ride before they could properly walk. Boys trained with bows and hunted for meat while still calling their mothers in the dark. Girls learned to tend animals, gather herbs, and manage the camp while the men were away at war. Women were not ornaments to be hidden or bound. On the steppe, they rode, they fought, and they ruled when the men were gone or dead. Life did not permit weakness, not in women, not in children, not in chiefs. Every mouth needed to pull its weight, and every man had to be ready to kill or be killed. There were no castles to retreat to, no walls to protect from an enemy's wrath. The only defense was speed. The only law was revenge. Mercy was a luxury for the dead. And yet, for all its cruelty, the steppe was also a place of extraordinary freedom. There were no kings with golden crowns to impose taxes. There were no iron chains to bind the poor to the soil. A man could rise by the merit of his courage and the sharpness of his blade. A woman could command respect through wisdom and strength. Reputation was currency, and honor, though often drenched in blood, meant more than coin or rank. It was a world of ceaseless motion, of wind and hoofbeats and the silence of snow. It was wild and untamed, filled with old songs passed down around fires and dreams that travelled with the herds from pasture to pasture. Before the iron heel of empire stamped its mark across Asia and Europe, the Mongol lands were a patchwork of blood, kinship, betrayal, and ancient pride. The steppe did not belong to one people. It was a chessboard of shifting alliances and rival chieftains, of raids and reprisal, where memory was long and vengeance never slept. Each tribe saw itself as chosen, descended from noble ancestors whose spirits still roamed the high grasses and whispered in the wind. Among them were the Tatars, the Merkits, the Karaits, the Naimans, the Onguds, and the Mongols themselves, who in those days were scattered into countless clans and broken families. Each name carried with it a history of triumph and humiliation, of old glories now faded and wounds never forgotten. The land was not ruled so much as survived, and those who hoped to lead did so with the knowledge that loyalty was a brittle thing, and betrayal was always one bad harvest away. The Tatars were the most prominent in those early centuries, feared and respected across the eastern steppe. They had once been puppets of the great Khitan Empire, and later the Jin dynasty of northern China, who used them as a buffer and a sword against other tribes. For a time, they flourished, playing the game of empires, raiding their neighbors with impunity while offering tribute to their distant masters. Their name became synonymous with treachery, not only for their dealings with foreign dynasties, but for the blood they spilled among their own. Yet for all their cunning, they could not withstand the tides of change when they turned. The Tatars would one day fall to a fury of vengeance that began in childhood and would echo across continents. To the west lay the Merkits, proud and predatory, notorious for their swift raids and their fierce defense of their herds. Their society was deeply bound to custom, proud of its autonomy and loath to bend the knee to any outsider. Their blood feud with the family of Temujin, born of a stolen bride and an act of violence that would never be forgiven, would become one of the most bitter and consequential rivalries in steppe history. The Merkits believed in the old ways, in honor won through the sword and preserved through vengeance. Their downfall, when it came, was not for lack of courage, but because they clung to the past while the future took shape in the saddle of a boy they once wronged. The Karaits were more complex still. They were a Christian tribe, followers of Nestorian Christianity brought centuries earlier through traders and wandering priests. Unlike their neighbors, they carried crosses into battle and carved churches of wood and felt among their yurts. Their khans maintained correspondence with both Eastern and Western rulers, believing they might one day rise above their station and form a kingdom to rival the cities of Persia or the courts of Byzantium. Their leader, Togrul, often called the Wang Khan, would become a pivotal figure in the early life of Genghis Khan, a father figure turned rival, a king undone by pride and the shifting winds of war. The Karaites were powerful, cultured, and doomed to fracture under the weight of ambition. Then there were the Naimans, perhaps the most formidable of them all. Their lands stretched across the western steppe, rich in game and grazing, dotted with trade routes and ancient burial grounds. They were numerous, literate, and proud of their nobility. Their rulers styled themselves as kings in the old manner, with advisors, scribes, and great camps that mimicked the courts of the settled world. For years, they resisted Mongol expansion with both sword and treaty, confident that no upstart coalition could break their hold on the land. They were wrong, but their defeat would come only after bitter war and great cost, and their legacy would linger long in the memory of the survivors. And amid all these tribes, both feared and ignored, were the Mongols themselves. In those years, the word Mongol referred less to a unified people and more to a loose collection of clans and families who spoke a similar tongue and herded in the same broad regions. They were not yet a nation. They had no king, no capital, no flag. Theirs was a name often used with scorn, a name associated with poverty and disunity. The Mongols quarrelled more often among themselves than with outsiders, locked in feuds that passed from father to son like a curse. The Taichiuds, the Jadaran, the Uriankai, and the Borjigin, all Mongol clans, all vying for dominance, all unwilling to yield even a single tent's worth of pasture. It was within this fragmented chaos that a leader would rise, not from conquest alone, but from the very heart of betrayal and hardship. The structure of tribal life was both simple and brutal. Every tribe was led by a Khan, whose authority depended entirely on his ability to command loyalty and deliver success. There were no thrones passed by blood without challenge. A Khan who lost a battle often lost his head. Power was fluid, contingent on strength, charisma, and marriage. Daughters were bargaining chips, sons were pawns in deadly games of alliance. Blood ties mattered, but so did bravery and cunning. Men who proved themselves in war could rise from nothing. Slaves could become generals, while the sons of Khans could be cast aside and forgotten. Authority was earned and maintained by constant vigilance. A single misstep, a single failed hunt, or a single rash decision could unmake a dynasty. War between tribes was seasonal, inevitable, and deeply personal. Cattle were stolen, jurs burned, herds scattered. Victors took captives, often women and children, and raised them as their own, or kept them as trophies of dominance. Blood feuds were commonplace, remembered not in parchment or court records, but in songs and scars. A warrior whose father had died in ambush would ride for years, biding his time for revenge. There were no declarations of war, only the sound of hoofbeats in the night, and the cry of alarm as arrows flew through felt walls. Yet it would be wrong to imagine the tribes as mere savages. They had traditions, laws, and a deep sense of identity. They held festivals, honoured ancestors, told epic tales of heroes and gods. Their music echoed across the plains on strings and flutes, their horses adorned with bells and ribbons for great ceremonies. They gathered at seasonal encampments, where tribes traded goods, exchanged brides, and swore oaths beneath the open sky. These gatherings were moments of uneasy peace, where the fate of generations could be shaped in a single shared cup of mare's milk. It was in this volatile and unforgiving world that the pieces began to move. The steppe was not waiting for a conqueror. It resisted unity, devoured ambition, and rewarded those who embraced its chaos. But beneath its surface, old orders were crumbling. Trade was shifting. Drought and harsh winters strained the herds. Ambitious men and women whispered of change, and somewhere in this expanse of wind and fire, a child born of betrayal and exile was learning to ride, to hunt, to survive. The tribes did not know it, but the world they had always known was beginning to end. The sky was still blue, the grass still bent to the wind, but the silence of history was breaking. The wolves and eagles would soon bow to a single name, and that name was Temujin. The boy was born beneath a sky thick with storm clouds, a sky that seemed to churn with the weight of history, yet unwritten. His mother named him Temujin, after a Tatar warrior his father had defeated in battle. There was no royal cradle, no written prophecy, no gathered court to mark the occasion. There was only the sound of wind through the grasslands and the quiet murmurs of women inside a felt tent. Yet the moment was heavy with omen. A clot of blood in the boy's fist was taken by the elders as a sign of greatness, a mark from the eternal blue sky. Such omens were not rare in the steppe, but they were remembered when they proved true. In time, that blood would prove to be the first of many. Temujin's father, Yesugei, was a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a minor leader among the scattered Mongol people. He was a man respected for his courage, known for his skill in war and his shrewdness in alliance. It was he who had stolen Hoelun, Temujin's mother, from another tribe, riding away with her from the camp of the Merkits and claiming her as his wife. That act, common enough on the steppe, would haunt the lives of her children for years to come. The Merkits would not forget the insult, nor forgive the humiliation. Temujin was born into a bloodline already entangled in revenge. For a time, the boy knew the comfort of protection. Yesugei brought his family near the Onon River, a land of green pastures and cold streams, where the air was rich with the scent of horses and the laughter of children. Temujin grew up among his brothers and sisters, learning to ride, to shoot, to listen to the old stories told by the fire. His mother, Hoelun, was a woman of fierce pride and unshakable strength. She taught her children the old ways, the lessons of the past, and the value of endurance. She told them never to beg, never to break, and never to forget. Her love was not gentle. It was carved from hardship and wrapped in iron. She kept the family together even as the world began to fall apart. When Temujin was still a boy, barely old enough to draw a bow with strength, his father was poisoned. Yesugei had been traveling, bringing his son to the camp of a distant ally for the first steps of arranging a future marriage. On the way home, he shared a meal with a group of Tatars, not knowing that among them were those who bore him an old grudge. He died in agony. Away from his family, his power vanished with his final breath. When the news reached the camp, the fragile protection that surrounded Temujin's family shattered like frost beneath hooves. The other clans turned away. The servants who once bowed to Yesugei now abandoned Hoelun and her children. The Borjigin name, once spoken with respect, became a liability. No man would rally behind a widow and her sons. The camp was stripped of livestock, left with nothing but bones and sorrow. They were exiled to the wild, left to starve among the rocks and frost. In those years, Temujin learned what it meant to hunger. He trapped rodents and dug for roots in the cold earth. He stole scraps of meat and watched his younger brothers cry with empty bellies. There were nights when the wind itself seemed to mock them, and days when the sun felt like a punishment. Yet through it all, Hoelun kept them alive. She made sure they remembered who they were. Not orphans, not beggars, but children of a warrior, heirs to a past that had not yet been erased. Temujin grew hard in those years, not cruel, not yet, but quiet and watchful. He did not forget the faces of those who had turned their backs on his mother. He did not forgive the relatives who had taken his father's herds and offered nothing in return. He spoke little, but he listened. He watched how power moved, how men followed strength, how oaths were made and broken with a smile. He learned that survival was not merely about strength. It was about understanding when to kneel and when to strike. About patience, the kind of patience that waits through storms and snow, biding its time like a falcon before the kill. Even among his own brothers, conflict festered. His half-brother Behter, older and arrogant, tried to assert dominance over the family. He hoarded food, claimed rights beyond his due, and ignored Hoelun's counsel. One day, the tension snapped. Temujin and his younger brother Kassar ambushed Behter and killed him. It was a brutal act, born of desperation and a fierce sense of justice. In the steppe, such a crime could have torn the family apart. But their mother understood. She did not weep, nor banish them. She simply reminded them of what they carried, of who they were meant to be. In blood, the path to leadership was already being carved. Temujin's life continued as a series of harsh lessons. He was captured by the Taichiuds, enemies of his father's clan, and held in slavery. They placed a wooden collar around his neck and watched him toil among their camps. But even in chains, he made allies. He remembered faces. He gauged loyalties. And when the moment came, he escaped with the help of a sympathetic herdsman. The experience did not break him. It sharpened him. He returned to his mother with new knowledge. The world was not ruled by fate alone. It was ruled by the will of those who understood how to bend others to their cause. As he grew into manhood, Temujin began to gather followers, not through wealth, which he lacked, nor through lineage, which was weakened, but through loyalty. He remembered the boys who had stood with him in hunger, the warriors who saw in him not a chieftain's son, but a leader shaped by suffering. He made alliances, sealed with blood and oath, not with gold. He found blood brothers, most famously Jamuka, whose friendship would later curdle into betrayal. He built a small but devoted band, not yet an army, but a spark. The tribe still did not see him as a threat. He was a ghost of a fallen family, a boy with too many enemies and too little power. But the steppe had changed him. He no longer believed in waiting for fate to deliver justice. He had seen what the strong could take, what the weak could lose, and he had decided he would never be the latter again. Somewhere in the silence between the mountains and the rivers, somewhere beneath the vast and ancient sky, a fire had begun to burn. It was not yet an empire. It was not yet a legend, but it was alive, and it would not be extinguished. Temujin's rise did not come with thunder or prophecy. It came slowly, with deliberate steps across uncertain ground, each one taken with a wariness learned through pain. In the years following his escape from the Taichiuds, he began to knit together a life from scraps of loyalty, gathering those who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He did not have riches, nor the great herds that made a man respected. What he had was clarity. He understood something few others did, that the world was changing, that the old way of loyalty to clan above all would break under the weight of ambition. He would not rule through ancestry. He would rule through trust, through law, and through the bond of men who chose each other. One of the first of these bonds was forged with Jamuka, a boy of noble lineage, handsome, charismatic, and with blood ties to powerful Mongol houses. As children, Temujin and Jamuka had grown close. They hunted together, shared meat and fire, and spoke in the quiet of the steppes as only brothers in spirit can. They swore Anda, the ancient oath of Mongol blood brotherhood, a pact deeper than kinship, stronger than allegiance to clan. In the eyes of the eternal blue sky, they became one soul split between two bodies. For a time, this bond gave them strength. Together, they gathered young warriors from broken families, from lesser clans, from the scattered and the brave. In the open plains, a new kind of following began to grow, not bound by blood, but by loyalty freely given. Temujin was not like the other chieftains. Where they ruled with arrogance and assumed obedience, he listened. He rewarded skill. He promoted those who had earned their place, regardless of their birth. A blacksmith's son could ride beside him in battle. A servant could rise to the rank of general. This merit, this fairness in a world ruled by cruelty, was intoxicating. Men who had been stepped over by the powerful came to him. They brought their wives, their children, their loyalty. And with each soul that joined his growing encampment, Temujin's vision took shape. He was not building a clan. He was building a nation. But change draws enemies. As Temujin rose, the old powers of the steppe took notice. The Taichuds, the Tartars, the Naimans, the Karaitas, each watched with unease as a man without noble birth began to gather warriors and speak of unity. To them, he was a threat, an upstart with dangerous ideas. Temujin's methods offended their pride. He took servants and made them commanders. He forgave the sons of enemies if they proved loyal. He gave power to women and outsiders. His rise undermined everything the old chiefs believed to be sacred. But Temujin was not building for their approval. He was building for victory. Tensions began to form between him and Jamuka. Though they had once been Anda, their visions of power diverged. Jamuka, with his noble blood and aristocratic bearing, believed in the old ways. He gathered the traditional elite around him, those who clung to titles and lineages. He was generous, but he expected loyalty born of heritage and position. Temujin, by contrast, was drawing a different kind of following. Men of the grass, men who had suffered, men who believed that strength and justice should guide the hand of leadership. For a time, the two men danced around their differences, but the steppe cannot hold two suns forever. The final breach came not with words, but with war. In 1187, the two former brothers turned their camps toward one another, and the Mongol world chose sides. Jamuka held the greater numbers, with 30,000 warriors drawn from the old bloodlines. Temujin had only 20,000, but they were loyal, hardened, and disciplined in ways the traditional armies were not. They fought at the river Dalan Baljut, where the land rolled like waves and the grass ran red with the blood of the future. For a day and a night they clashed, arrows hissing through the air, horses screaming, the ground torn by hooves and iron. At first, Temujin's smaller force held fast, maneuvering with skill, using the tactics he had honed in years of desperate battle. But numbers told the story. By the second day, Jamuka's forces overwhelmed them. The defeat was devastating. Jamuka captured many of Temujin's men, and in a display of cruelty meant to terrify, he executed 70 young warriors by boiling them alive. It was a horror that seared itself into memory. Yet even in loss, Temujin's legend grew. His men remembered his courage, his loyalty, his refusal to abandon them in defeat. They returned to him when the dust settled. Others came, drawn by his endurance, his refusal to die, his promise of a new order. Jamuka may have won the battle, but Temujin had begun to win the future. In the years that followed, Temujin focused not on vengeance, but on rebuilding. He consolidated his forces, renewed old alliances, and continued to govern with an iron sense of justice. He imposed order where none had existed. Theft was punished, even if committed by his closest allies. Cowardice in battle was shamed. Every decision, every action was designed to show that the new world he envisioned would be ruled by law, not whim. He created a code of conduct, a system of rules that applied to every man equally, and he enforced it without hesitation. Slowly, steadily, the Mongol tribes began to see him not as a rival, but as a leader who could bring an end to the endless cycles of betrayal and revenge. When the time came, Temujin moved against the Tatars, those who had poisoned his father so many years before. It was not merely a campaign, it was an act of historical justice. He crushed them with calculated fury, slaughtered their leaders, and absorbed their people into his own. Those who resisted were executed. Those who submitted were brought into the fold, given places in his growing hierarchy. The steppe had never seen such a campaign, one that blended conquest with transformation. The tribes were no longer separate. They were becoming Mongol. The old world was ending. Temujin was no longer merely a survivor. He was becoming something else, a unifier, a warlord, a lawgiver. The man born in exile, who had known chains and hunger, was now the storm gathering on the horizon. He had lost battles, lost brothers, lost everything once, but he had never lost belief in the order he could create. The blood spilled at Dalan Baljut had not been wasted. It had watered the ground from which an empire would rise, and soon the steppe itself would speak with one voice, the voice of Genghis Khan. The steppe had never known unity. It was a land of blood feuds and ancestral pride, where men remembered old insults longer than they remembered seasons of peace. Every tribe thought itself chosen, every chieftain dreamed of dominion, yet none had ever succeeded in binding the plains under a single rule. The Khitan, the Jurchen, even the mighty Turks of old had tried to impose order upon the wild grasses and the horse lords who rode through them, but the land rejected such ambitions. The steppe devoured kings. It shattered empires. It consumed the dreams of those who believed it could be tamed. And yet Temujin, born into exile and obscurity, had begun to accomplish what centuries of warriors and prophets had failed to do. He was not trying to mimic the old ways. He was destroying them. In the years that followed his defeat at Dalan Baljut, Temujin worked not to recover pride, but to craft a foundation. He traveled from camp to camp, not with threats, but with promises. He promised protection from raiders. He promised a world where a poor herder could rise through valor, and where the son of a slave could become a commander. He demanded loyalty, but he gave stability in return. He spoke often of law, of order, of a shared destiny that transcended clan and bloodline. This was no longer about his personal vengeance. It had grown beyond the deaths of his father and brothers. He had come to believe that only through unification could the Mongol people survive the tides that pressed upon them from the south, the west, and the east. The tribal chieftains despised this vision. They saw it as heresy, a betrayal of the old customs. For centuries, the Mongols and their neighbors had lived by the ancient code of steppe autonomy. Each clan ruled itself. Each Khan was sovereign within his own camp. They joined together in times of war, then fell back into rivalry when the danger passed. Temujin's insistence on a single law, a single ruler, a single system of justice threatened to erase the very fabric of their identities. And so, the resistance grew. It came not as open rebellion at first, but in whispers, in desertions, in alliances formed in the dark. Temujin struck first, not with fire, but with order. He began restructuring his forces. No longer would warriors be grouped by clan. Instead, he divided his followers into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each led by commanders appointed by merit. Brothers were separated. Clans were fractured by design. Loyalty was no longer to a bloodline, but to the leader of the unit, and above them, to Temujin himself. These units could be moved quickly, commanded easily, and punished or rewarded without interference from tribal politics. For the first time in the history of the steppe, an army was built on discipline rather than inheritance. He did not stop at the military. He began crafting laws, rules meant to govern everything from theft and murder to the treatment of captives and the duties of soldiers. This growing body of custom would later be known as the Yasa, a living code said to be handed down from the eternal blue sky itself, though in truth it came from Temujin's relentless understanding of justice and his memory of every betrayal he had ever suffered. The Yasa demanded loyalty, demanded service, and demanded discipline. It outlawed the kidnapping of women, an ancient and common practice, and declared that leaders would be chosen by merit rather than ancestry. These laws were enforced with swift, often brutal punishment, but they created something the tribes had never known, a sense of shared identity. Opposition to this new order coalesced around familiar enemies. The Merkits, still bitter from past defeats, allied with the Naimans and the remnants of the powerful Tatars. Even the Keretis, once Temujin's strongest allies through his relationship with the One Khan Togrul, began to grow uneasy. Togrul had once treated Temujin like a son, sheltering him and granting him troops, but now he looked upon his former protégé with growing suspicion. The boy had grown into a man, and that man was gathering more power than any subordinate should. When Jamuka returned from exile to join the resistance, the stage was set for civil war on a scale the Mongols had never seen. The years between 1190 and 1204 were soaked in blood. Temujin moved swiftly, destroying the Tatars with a fury sharpened by the memory of his father's murder. He annihilated their leadership and absorbed their people into his growing state. To secure loyalty, he married their women into his own circle and distributed their children among his officers to be raised as Mongols. The act was both political and psychological. He was unmaking tribes and reforging them into a single people, united not by name, but by allegiance. His break with Togrul came next. The Karites, still powerful and wealthy, could not accept that their ally had become their rival. Temujin offered peace, but was refused. When battle came, it was fierce and final. Togrul was defeated and killed, not by Temujin's hand, but by his own people as he tried to flee. The Karites were scattered, their lands taken, their warriors folded into Temujin's ranks. With each victory, his power grew, not merely in numbers, but in authority. He no longer needed to beg for allegiance. Chiefs came to him willingly, or they vanished. The final confrontation came again with Jamuka, the blood brother turned enemy. In 1201, Jamuka had once more declared himself Gur Khan, a title of ancient prestige meaning universal ruler, granted by his allies among the Naimans and other aristocratic tribes. He sought to rally the old order against the revolution Temujin had unleashed. But the ground had shifted. By 1204, their armies met again, this time not as boys with dreams, but as warlords with destiny in their eyes. The battle was long and bitter. Temujin's forces, better organized and more cohesive, prevailed. Jamuka fled, was betrayed, and delivered into the hands of the man he had once called brother. Temujin did not have him executed in haste. He offered him mercy, even a place at his side. Jamuka refused. He said that two eagles cannot share the same sky. He asked for a noble death, and Temujin granted it. He was killed without pain, without humiliation. In this moment, the last great rival of the steppe fell, and Temujin stood alone, not merely as a conqueror, but as a unifier. The tribal order had been broken. The clans were no longer sovereign. The laws of the old steppe, where every chief was king of his own tent, had been replaced by something new. The the Mongol people for the first time were not merely a scattered collection of families. They were a nation. In 1206, at a great assembly by the Onon River, the Kurultai of all tribes gathered. They crowned Temujin not as chieftain, not as warlord, but as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the man blessed by the eternal blue sky to lead his people. The title was not ceremonial. It was a declaration of transformation. The Mongol tribes had become the Mongol Empire, and the world, though it did not yet know it, would tremble. In the year 1206, upon the wide green banks of the Onon River, beneath the open vault of the eternal blue sky, Temujin was declared Genghis Khan. It was a moment centuries in the making, the final stitch in a tapestry woven from betrayal, endurance, and blood. The assembled tribes, once enemies sworn to destroy one another, now knelt together in recognition of a single ruler. The ceremony was no mere coronation, it was a transformation. Temujin had not merely won battles, he had undone the ancient order of the steppe and recast it in his image. The boy who once trapped marmots for food and slept in the snow beside a grieving mother had become the sovereign of all the Mongols. And now, having forged a people from fragments, he turned his gaze outward to the world beyond the steppe. The Mongol Empire was not born with cities or temples. It had no palaces, no written histories, no silver coinage bearing the image of its founder. It was built instead on the back of horses and the weight of loyalty. Genghis Khan understood that if his rule were to survive beyond his lifetime, it would need more than victories. It would need a system. An empire, even one that travelled on horseback, could not endure on charisma alone. It had to be shaped, not just conquered. And so he began to craft the bones of a nation. His first and greatest tool was the army. It was not an army in the manner of the kingdoms to the west or the dynasties to the south. It was a living machine, formed from discipline, fear, and reward. It was organized into precise units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men. Each had its leader, and each leader owed their position to merit, not blood. Brothers were placed in different units. Clans were deliberately dispersed. This destroyed the old tribal loyalties and created a new one that flowed only upward, toward Genghis Khan himself. Soldiers trained relentlessly, practicing maneuvers that allowed them to move with the precision of dancers. Communication was swift and sophisticated, carried by flags, drums, and relay messengers on horseback. When the Mongol army moved, it did so as a single creature, and when it struck, it did so without warning. Their weapon was the composite bow, a marvel of engineering made from horn, wood, and sinew. It could pierce armor at 200 yards, and Mongol archers could fire it with deadly accuracy from horseback while galloping at full speed. Each warrior carried several, along with a curved saber, a lasso, and often a lance. They were trained from childhood to ride without saddle or reins, guiding their horses with their knees, freeing both hands for the bow. They could feign retreat to lure enemies into ambush. They could vanish into the steppe like ghosts. No army in the world could match their speed, and few could withstand their fury. But Genghis Khan knew that force alone would not hold an empire together. He needed to bind his people not just with fear, but with identity. He expanded and codified the Yasa, the body of law that governed every aspect of life under his rule. Theft, adultery, desertion, and treason were punished with swift death. But alongside these brutal commands were protections. Religious freedom was enshrined. The poor were spared excessive taxes. Even the environment was protected in some cases, with strict limits placed on hunting during breeding seasons. The yasa was not written down in full, but it was memorized and enforced rigorously. It became the invisible spine of the empire, holding together a population that ranged from mountain herders to conquered scholars and merchants. He reformed the aristocracy, replacing hereditary titles with appointed ranks. His most trusted generals were men who had once been his enemies, men who had once been slaves, and men who had once walked in chains. He placed women in positions of power, relying on his mother Holan and his wife Berta for counsel, and granting leadership roles to daughters and daughters-in-law. In a world where women were often bartered or silenced, Genghis Khan gave them a voice, not out of charity, but because he had seen the strength of women in hardship, and he respected what endured. Communication was critical in holding his vast territory. To this end, he created the yam, a postal system that stretched across the steppes and beyond. Relay stations were built at intervals, each staffed with fresh horses and riders. Messages, orders, and intelligence could travel across the empire faster than any other civilization had managed. These posts also served as lodgings for travelers and officials, creating a network of safe passage that would soon benefit merchants, envoys, and spies alike. The roads of the Mongol Empire would carry more than soldiers. They would carry the future. He also understood the value of knowledge, even if he did not possess the script to write it himself. He ordered the creation of a Mongol script, adapted from the Uyghur alphabet, and began collecting advisors from among the peoples he conquered. Chinese engineers, Muslim scholars, Persian administrators, all found a place in his court. He did not care for their race or religion. He cared for their usefulness. This willingness to absorb the best from every culture became one of the defining strengths of his empire. He did not seek to erase the civilizations he conquered. He sought to harness them. As his reach grew, so did his ambition. The steppe had been unified, but beyond its borders lay kingdoms that had once looked upon the Mongols with disdain. The Jin dynasty of northern China, the Khwarezmian Empire of Central Asia, the sultanates and caliphates of the Muslim world, and the Christian kings of the distant West, all seemed ripe for conquest. Genghis Khan believed with unshakable certainty that the eternal blue sky had chosen him to rule the world. This was not metaphor or vanity. It was a truth he carried as deeply as his sword. He spoke often of his mission as divine, and his soldiers believed it. They believed they were not just spreading rule, but bringing order to chaos. Yet even in this moment of triumph, he was not at peace. He never forgot betrayal. He never ceased to prepare for revolt. He rotated his generals, kept spies within his own ranks, and maintained a brutal system of discipline. Entire families were punished for the crimes of individuals. Cities were razed to send messages. Mercy was offered once. Defiance was punished absolutely. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was policy. Genghis Khan understood that fear was faster than diplomacy. And in the early days of empire, speed was everything. By 1206, the steppe had been changed beyond recognition. What had once been a wasteland of scattered camps and endless blood feuds was now a war machine, an empire on the move. The gers still stood, the horses still grazed, the fires still burned beneath the stars, but the people had become something new. They were no longer tribes. They were Mongols. They wore the same colors. They obeyed the same laws. They followed the same master, and he, in turn, promised them the world. The wind still howled across the plains. The wolves still circled in the dark. But now the steppe had a ruler, not just of men, but of destiny, and he was ready to test his strength beyond the horizon. The tools had been forged, the armies had been built, the laws had been carved into memory, the empire had been born, and its hunger was only beginning. The land to the south of the steppe had long been a world apart. It was a world of silk and scholars, of walls that reached toward the heavens and cities that pulsed with the breath of centuries. China, ancient and immense, had always stood as both prize and peril to the nomads of the north. Its wealth dazzled the eye. Its armies guarded the plains with an arrogance born of dynastic memory. And yet, again and again, the wall had failed. The horsemen of the steppe had always found ways through the cracks. The Khitan had come before, so had the Yurshin. Now it was the turn of the Mongols. Genghis Khan had no illusions about the scale of what lay ahead. The Jin dynasty, which ruled the northern half of China, was no mere kingdom. It was a vast bureaucratic machine that spanned rivers, mountains, and forests, with armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands and fortresses that seemed to rise from the stone itself. The Jin emperors ruled from their capital at Zhongdu, a city girded by walls and thick with the incense of courtly ritual. They controlled fertile farmland, bustling markets, and some of the oldest written institutions on the earth. Yet Genghis Khan saw something else beneath the marble and silk. He saw weakness. He saw corruption. He saw a dynasty grown soft with luxury and divided by court intrigues and regional dissent. And more than anything, he saw opportunity. The campaign began not with a declaration, but with provocation. The Jin had for years played a careful game with the steppe. They had encouraged rivalries among the tribes, paid tribute to some and punished others, all to ensure that no single power would ever rise strong enough to challenge them. But Genghis Khan had broken their game board. He had unified the tribes, silenced the rivalries, and now he demanded to be treated not as a tool of foreign policy, but as an equal sovereign. The Jin court responded with scorn. They dismissed him as a barbarian chieftain and executed his envoys, an act of arrogance that would prove fatal. In 1211, the Mongol horde crossed into Jin territory, not as raiders, but as an army of conquest. They came not for plunder, but for empire. Their numbers were smaller than the Jin armies, but their movement was liquid, their coordination unmatched. The Mongols swept through the northern defenses, capturing frontier fortresses with terrifying efficiency. Where the Jin generals relied on heavy infantry and rigid formations, the Mongols rode like wind through the mountains and plains. They broke lines with volleys of arrows, retreated with feigned cowardice, and then returned like wolves to cut down those who pursued. Chinese cities, long used to resisting steppe incursions with walls and patience, found themselves besieged by enemies who understood engineering as well as they understood war. Genghis Khan did not rely solely on Mongol skill. He employed Chinese and Muslim engineers, experts in siege warfare, who constructed trebuchets and catapults, siege towers and battering rams. No city was safe behind stone. The Mongols learned quickly, adapted without pride, and crushed resistance without mercy. Towns that surrendered were spared, their people absorbed and often set to work. Towns that resisted were annihilated, their inhabitants slaughtered, their walls razed to the ground. The message was simple and deliberate. Submission brought survival. Defiance brought extinction. By 1213, the Mongol armies had reached the great walls that separated the steppe from the heartland. The Jin court, desperate and panicked, attempted to buy peace with gold and promises. But Genghis Khan did not come for tribute. He came for justice, for vengeance, and for conquest. He bypassed the strongest fortifications by using mountain passes and lesser-known roads, striking at the softer underbelly of the empire. The Jin generals, more skilled in court ceremony than in battlefield command, failed to anticipate the speed and precision of the Mongol advance. Then came the fall of the outer cities. Datong, Zhangjiakou, and other strongholds crumbled under the relentless siege. Refugees poured into Zhongdu, the imperial capital, bringing stories of slaughter and despair. The emperor ordered a full defense, bolstering the garrison and readying the city for the storm. But it was already too late. The Mongols surrounded Zhongdu in 1215. They choked off its supplies, harassed its walls day and night, and cut down any who tried to flee. Inside, hunger spread. Panic grew. Rumors turned to riots. The court descended into paranoia and blame. The Mongols waited. When the walls finally broke, it was not merely a victory. It was a demonstration. Zhongdu, now part of modern-day Beijing, was sacked with brutal thoroughness. Its palaces were looted. Its streets ran red with blood. The defenders were put to the sword. The city, once a jewel of the Jin realm, was left a broken relic beneath the hooves of a nomadic army that had come from a world the court had once considered beneath contempt. Genghis Khan did not remain to rule. He left behind governors and commanders, trusted men who would oversee tribute and law, and returned to the steppe to prepare for what would come next. Yet he did not withdraw entirely. He had shown the Jin that their walls were meaningless. He had left behind devastation that would echo for decades, and he had opened a permanent wound in the dynasty's side. Though the Jin would continue to rule for years, their strength was broken. Their people no longer believed in the safety of the emperor. Their borders were shattered. And throughout the Mongol realm, the victory became legend. It was not simply that a steppe warlord had taken a city. It was that a world once closed to the nomads had been forced open by fire. The conquest of northern China was only the beginning. Genghis Khan had tested the empire he had built. He had seen it hold under the pressures of siege, terrain, and scale. He had seen the loyalty of his commanders proven. He had seen that his reforms, his laws, his vision could reach beyond the steppe and sink their teeth into the heart of civilization. And now he knew what lay ahead. There would be no retreat, no return to the old ways. The Mongol Empire had tasted the wealth of the south, and the hunger of empire had only begun. In the wake of the storm that leveled Zhongdu, the Jin dynasty stood fractured and trembling. What had once been a confident regime of mandarins and generals was now a shaken court surrounded by ashes and hollowed cities. The emperor, Xuanzong, fled the ruined capital, dragging what remained of his court southward in desperation. The city of Kaifeng, once a rival capital of the fallen Song dynasty, became his new seat, though it offered little of the glory and protection that Zhongdu once had. The Mongols had not merely seized territory. They had shattered the illusion of permanence. For centuries, Chinese dynasties had weathered invasion through ritual, bureaucracy, and patience. Genghis Khan had undone that in a matter of years, and the Jin emperor, once seen as the son of heaven, now cast a long shadow of uncertainty over his people. Genghis Khan did not chase the fleeing emperor with the fury of a conqueror eager to finish the job. Instead, he withdrew. It was not from weakness or fear, but from deliberation. He had never intended to hold every inch of the Jin realm, nor did he have the men to occupy such a vast and densely populated region. His war had never been about land alone. It was about power and recognition, and above all, it was about sending a message. The Mongols had come to show the Jin court that the steppe would not be bought or dismissed, that the sovereign of the north now stood outside their gates, not as a supplicant, but as a rival emperor in his own right. To hold the north, Genghis Khan established a system of military governors and tribute collectors. Cities that surrendered were allowed to function with a semblance of autonomy, provided they paid what was demanded. Grain, cloth, gold, weapons, and animals flowed northward to feed and equip the Mongol machine. In exchange, peace was offered, but it was the peace of the sword, not of diplomacy. Those who hesitated were reminded of Zhongdu. The stories of that fall spread faster than any envoy, and across the countryside, magistrates and local lords measured the worth of resistance against the reality of fire and steel. Genghis Khan's governance in the occupied territories was pragmatic. He did not attempt to impose Mongol culture on the cities. He did not destroy temples or ban local languages. He ruled lightly, but with clarity. His emissaries enforced the collection of tribute. His soldiers patrolled the roads. His name was written into official decrees. And his presence, though distant, became a spectre that haunted every court that dared consider rebellion. He was not physically present, but his power had become an atmosphere, heavy and inescapable. He had mastered the art of ruling from afar, and the occupied cities found themselves trapped not in chains, but in the web of an empire that allowed them to live only so long as they obeyed. Yet the conquest of the north revealed a deeper truth to Genghis Khan and his advisors. The steppe was no longer enough. The nomadic lifestyle, though still sacred, could not sustain the empire he was building. The riches of the Chinese cities were not merely luxuries, they were necessities: silk for armor and trade, grain for armies, iron for weapons, paper for administration. The cities fed the steppe, and the steppe in turn provided the horsemen who enforced Mongol rule. This symbiosis was dangerous, but it was inevitable. Genghis Khan did not try to stop it. He adapted. The old idea that a Mongol ruler must remain forever on the grasslands began to bend. Permanent administrators were installed in captured regions. Local elites, once dismissed as decadent, were now recruited as scribes and advisors. A new class of mixed governance emerged, where Mongol generals shared power with Chinese officials. This uneasy partnership became one of the enduring legacies of the conquest. It brought stability, but it also brought change. The Mongols, once free riders of the open world, began to feel the weight of cities and the complexities of rule. It was not only China that watched this transformation. To the west, in the lands of the Khwarezmian Empire, and to the south, where the Song dynasty still held the lower Yangtze, observers took note. The Jin had been considered a powerful buffer. Its weakening opened the floodgates for new ambitions and new threats. Rumors of the Mongol armies, swift and merciless, began to travel along the Silk Roads. Merchants spoke of cities that had vanished in a single season. Scholars debated whether the horsemen were a divine scourge or a punishment sent by heaven. And always, the name of Genghis Khan grew, larger than the man himself, heavier than myth. But Genghis Khan remained clear-eyed. He knew his victories were incomplete. The Jin emperor still lived. the southern provinces remained unbroken. The Song dynasty still held the wealthiest regions of the Chinese world. He did not yet have the strength to destroy them all. His army, though unmatched in skill, was small by comparison. The northern campaign had cost lives, exhausted supplies, and stretched his forces across unfamiliar terrain. He chose to pause, to let the wounds of the Jin fester on their own, and to prepare for greater campaigns elsewhere. In his temporary withdrawal, Genghis Khan revealed another of his many gifts. He knew when to stop. He knew that an empire was not built by endless motion, but by rhythm. Advance, consolidate, reform, and only then strike again. While his generals governed the north, he returned to the heart of his domain. He oversaw the selection of new commanders, the revision of laws, the movement of herds. He ensured the lines of communication remained open. He ensured that the empire of the horse did not forget its soul while it reached into foreign lands. And yet, even in retreat, he remained in the minds of those he had conquered. The emperor of the Jin dynasty, reduced now to a fugitive sovereign ruling from a crumbling city, lived each day under the weight of that absence. It was a silence louder than drums. The threat of Genghis Khan's return became a tool in itself. His enemies braced for invasions that never came, spent fortunes on walls that would never be tested. Fear had become a form of rule, and Genghis Khan wielded it with precision. Thus, the shadow of the emperor grew. He did not sit upon a jade throne, nor wear robes of embroidered silk. He had no dragon carved into his walls, no incense burning in his name. And yet, in the minds of millions, he had become emperor in all but title. Not because he claimed heaven's mandate, but because he had proven that his law, his strength, and his vision could not be denied. While the Jin emperor watched his realm shrink, Genghis Khan prepared, not for peace, not for reconciliation, but for the next war. The cities of the east had been tested. Now his gaze would fall to the west, and there, too, the sky would burn. Victory on the steppe was measured in spoils and songs, but conquest in China came with a different price. The battles were won, the cities were taken, the enemies scattered. Yet beneath the surface of triumph lay a deeper toll, one not easily counted by the weight of silver or the number of surrendered fortresses. The cost of the northern campaign was carved into the very structure of the Mongol army, into the minds of its commanders, and into the landscape of a kingdom left in ruins. Genghis Khan had proved that the Jin dynasty could bleed. But in doing so, he had learned how deeply the land could resist, even as it crumbled. The siege of Zhongdu alone had consumed a season and a generation. Thousands of horses had perished during the long months of encirclement, their bodies stripped for meat and leather as winter bit deep into the earth. Mongol warriors, who had grown strong on the freedom of the grasslands, now found themselves mired in the cold stone shadow of cities. Disease spread in the tightly packed camps. Arrows flew not across open fields, but between high walls and through the narrow alleys of shattered towns. The enemy was no longer a scattered host of steppe horsemen, but a concentrated force, hiding behind massive gates, protected by moats, defended by towers that reached into the sky. The way of war had changed. And the warriors themselves had changed. They had tasted the wealth of the south and found it both tempting and dangerous. Silk lay in piles, too soft to protect a man in battle, but beautiful in the firelight. Gold and jade, once meaningless to men raised on meat and hide, now glittered in their hands. Women of foreign dress and strange tongues were taken, some as wives, others as prisoners. The sons of herdsmen, once hardened by winters without firewood, now feasted on rice and sweetened wine. Genghis Khan saw this and understood what it meant. Luxury softened men. Idleness bred weakness. He allowed no plunder without permission. He punished disorder with death. He reminded his soldiers again and again that they were not conquerors of stone and silk, but riders of the wind, children of the eternal blue sky. The empire was to be made in their image, not surrendered to the comforts of those they had defeated. Still, the transition from nomad to ruler was underway. The Mongols, for all their discipline, could not escape the consequences of rule. Administration was required, tribute had to be counted, roads had to be kept safe, and markets watched for corruption. Genghis Khan appointed governors, many of them Chinese or Turkic, chosen for their loyalty and skill rather than their ancestry. He brought scribes and accountants into his court. He ordered the construction of storehouses and granaries, not for himself, but to feed the soldiers and civilians under his rule. The warrior who had once led raids against isolated encampments now managed the logistics of an empire that stretched across deserts, mountains, and floodplains. This was not a conquest of weeks. It was a transformation that would unfold over decades, each year further binding the nomads to the cities they had once scorned. Among the conquered, resentment simmered. The fall of Zhongdu and the devastation of the northern provinces created rivers of refugees. Farmers fled their fields. Scholars abandoned their libraries. Monks, scattered from monasteries, turned to ash. Some turned to banditry, others to rebellion, and still others faded into the underworld of defeated empires, waiting for a time when the conqueror's hand might falter. The Jin dynasty, though broken, was not yet dead. In the south, it still held fertile lands and standing armies. It still whispered of restoration. Genghis Khan had struck a mortal blow, but the serpent still writhed. The common people bore the heaviest burden. For every city taken by surrender, there were others that resisted, and for those, there was no mercy. The Mongol strategy was clear and uncompromising. Resistance brought destruction. Not only the soldiers died, but the officials, the scribes, the craftsmen, even the children. Entire towns were reduced to silence, their names preserved only in the chronicles of those who witnessed their end. To the Mongols, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was policy. Terror was a weapon as sharp as any blade. It moved faster than cavalry. It broke resistance before the first arrow flew. In time, it became a legend, and legends ruled more firmly than laws. And yet, for all its horrors, Mongol conquest was not purely a tale of fire. Genghis Khan sought more than destruction. He sought order. In cities that surrendered, he spared temples. He protected merchants. He allowed officials to remain in place if they swore loyalty. Trade resumed quickly, and roads once plagued by bandits were patrolled with ruthless precision. Markets opened beneath new banners. Laws were enforced not by caprice, but by decree. The Yasa stretched into the Chinese countryside, not as a foreign imposition, but as a promise of security to those who accepted its rule. In this way, the conqueror's shadow grew longer and his presence deeper. But the balance was fragile. The soldiers longed for the plains. The horses withered on southern grain. The empire had moved beyond the horizon of the steppe. and with each step, it risked losing the very soul that had given it strength. Genghis Khan knew this. He would not remain in the cities. He would not drape himself in silks or sit upon a dragon throne. He returned north to the grass and wind, to the place where power came not from marble, but from motion. He left others to govern what had been taken. His mind, even then, was turning westward. The campaign against the Jinn had opened a door. It had revealed the world to the Mongols, not just China, but Persia, India, the lands beyond the Caspian Sea, and the kingdoms of Europe. The horizon no longer ended at the Yellow River. It now stretched toward places where the names were unfamiliar, but the wealth was unmistakable. The great Khan had tested his army against one of the most ancient civilizations on Earth, and it had not only endured, it had triumphed. The cost had been high. The blood of warriors, the innocence of cities, the simplicity of the old life, all were spent on the altar of empire. And yet, the hunger remained. The world beyond still waited, and Genghis Khan, forged in exile and sharpened by vengeance, was not done. The dust had barely settled over the ruins of Zhongdu. The ashes were still warm, and already the riders were saddling their horses again. The sky above the steppe had not changed. It remained vast, cold, and eternal. And beneath it, a storm was gathering once more. The fire had barely cooled in the ruins of Zhongdu when Genghis Khan turned his gaze westward. China had taught him much. It had taught him that cities, once thought invulnerable, could fall like tents before a prairie storm. It had shown him that discipline, planning, and ruthlessness could shatter empires more ancient than memory. But it had also revealed something else, an insatiable appetite, not just for plunder or power, but for dominion. The conquest of China had opened the world to the Mongols, and across the high passes and sun-baked deserts of Central Asia lay another prize, rich and glittering, guarded by arrogance rather than strength. That prize was the Khwarezmian Empire. The Khwarezmians ruled a vast swathe of territory stretching from the eastern shores of the Caspian Sea to the fertile plains of Persia. Their cities were old and magnificent: Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur, Merv, each a jewel of Islamic civilization, filled with scholars, merchants, mosques, and palaces. Their sultan, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, sat upon a throne inherited through conquest and held through intrigue. His empire had grown rapidly, devouring smaller neighbors and seizing trade routes that once belonged to older dynasties. But for all its wealth and apparent grandeur, the Khwarezmian realm was brittle. Its administration was fragmented. Its military leadership was divided by jealousy, and at its head was a ruler whose pride outpaced his wisdom. Genghis Khan did not march on Khwarezm out of greed, at least not at first. He sought peace. He saw the empire as a trading partner, not an enemy. In 1218, he sent a delegation of merchants, protected by envoys, to establish relations. They traveled with goods and gifts, hoping to open a corridor between the Mongol heartlands and the markets of Persia. The mission was honorable. The response was not. In the city of Otrar, one of the Khwarezmian border governors, a man named Inalchuk, arrested the caravan on suspicion of espionage. He seized their goods, imprisoned their members, and eventually executed them. When Genghis Khan learned of this, he did not respond with immediate violence. Instead, he sent a second delegation, this time 3 trusted envoys demanding justice. Sultan Muhammad, either out of arrogance or fear, made a fatal choice. He had one of the envoys executed and the other 2 mutilated. Their heads were shaved and their beards burned, a deliberate insult in the eyes of the steppe. The message was clear. The Khwarezmian Empire would not be intimidated. Genghis Khan received that message and returned one of his own. He called his generals. He summoned his sons. He gathered the largest army he had ever commanded. The time for peace had ended. The time for vengeance had come. In the spring of 1219, the Mongol host crossed the Jaxartes River. It moved like a tide, silent and unrelenting. Genghis Khan did not strike at a single city. He struck at the empire itself, aiming to unmake it from within. His forces split into several columns, each taking a different path through the Khwarezmian territory. Cities that once believed themselves untouchable were besieged in days. Otrar, where the insult had begun, was the first to fall. It resisted bravely, but the Mongols breached its walls after 5 months. Inalchuk was captured. Genghis Khan ordered molten silver poured into his eyes and mouth, a punishment as theatrical as it was brutal. Then came Bukhara, a city of scholars and wealth, surrounded by high walls and filled with mosques and madrasas. The Mongols approached with speed and deception, pretending to retreat